Chandler, Ohio, was one of those small American towns where everyone knew each other, and the biggest news was usually about the school basketball team's results or the next harvest festival. The population was just over 8,000, and most families had lived there for several generations. The main street stretched for only 12 blocks, lined with small shops, cafes, and offices, creating the atmosphere of a mid-century American province. Every morning at 7:30, Oscar Mitchell opened his auto repair shop on the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue. At 45, he was a strong man with hands covered in calluses from years of working with tools. His shop, Mitchell Auto Repair, served half the town, from old farmers' pickup trucks to the family sedans of local school teachers. Oscar was proud of his reputation as an honest mechanic who never overcharged and always finished the job on time. The Mitchells' house stood in a quiet neighborhood on Elm Street, a two-story building with white siding and blue shutters. Susan carefully tended the small garden in front of the house, where tulips and daffodils bloomed every spring. At 41, she still had the beauty that had once captivated Oscar in high school. Susan now worked as a third-grade teacher at Chandler Elementary School, where she was loved by both children and parents for her patience and kind nature. The couple had two children, 16-year-old Jason, who had inherited his father's interest in mechanics, and 14-year-old Emily, who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. In the evenings, the family gathered for dinner to discuss the day's events, weekend plans, and the children's schoolwork. From the outside, the Mitchells looked like a model middle-class American family, stable, close-knit, and happy. However, beneath the surface of this family bliss, cracks were forming that were becoming increasingly visible. Oscar was spending more and more time in his workshop, citing a heavy workload. Susan noticed that her husband had become distracted, often responding to her questions with one-word answers and avoiding physical intimacy. When she tried to talk about it, Oscar dismissed her, explaining his behavior as fatigue and stress from work. On the other side of town, in a small residential complex called Pine Valley Apartments, lived Deborah Brown. Her one-room apartment on the second floor was modestly furnished with secondhand furniture and decorated with lots of potted flowers, the only joy in her gray, everyday life. At 42, Deborah worked as a cashier at Food Mart, where she spent 8 hours a day ringing up groceries and smiling at customers with a forced smile. Deborah had been divorced for 5 years. Her ex-husband Rick had left her for another woman, leaving her with loans and a broken heart. They had no children. Doctors diagnosed infertility, which was one of the reasons for the breakdown of the marriage. After the divorce, Deborah moved to Chandler, hoping to start a new life, but loneliness and depression followed her there. For the past 2 years, Deborah has been seeing psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Green in a nearby town. The doctor diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder with elements of bipolar disorder. Deborah took antidepressants and mood stabilizers, which helped her function in everyday life but could not completely eliminate her feelings of emptiness and despair. Dr. Green noted in her records the patient's tendency to idealize and devalue people, intense but unstable interpersonal relationships, and periodic bouts of anger. Deborah often spoke of her desire to find true love that would fill the void in her life and give meaning to her existence. At the supermarket, Deborah was known as a quiet, diligent employee who rarely participated in conversations with her colleagues and preferred to eat lunch alone. Manager Frank Johnson appreciated her punctuality and attention to detail, although he sometimes noticed that she reacted too emotionally to criticism or even harmless remarks. Deborah and Oscar met by chance 3 months ago. Deborah brought her old Honda to the repair shop. The car had started making strange noises, and she was afraid that the repairs would cost a lot of money, which she didn't have. Oscar inspected the car and found that the problem was minor. All that was needed was to replace a worn-out generator belt. "It'll be just $40 with labor," he said, seeing the relief on the woman's face. "I'll do it right now. It'll take about 20 minutes. While Oscar worked, Deborah watched him from the reception area. She noticed how carefully and professionally he handled his tools and how patiently he explained the reason for the breakdown to another customer. His movements exuded confidence and care, qualities that were so lacking in her life. When the car was ready, Deborah thanked Oscar with unusual enthusiasm. He smiled back, a simple, friendly smile that touched her heart. For the first time in a long time, a man had treated her with genuine concern, expecting nothing in return. In the weeks that followed, Deborah found reasons to stop by the workshop. Sometimes she thought the car was running unevenly. Other times she wanted advice on changing the oil. Oscar was always polite and attentive, and gradually they began to exchange not only words about repairs, but also more personal conversations. Deborah learned that Oscar was married with children, but this did not dampen her interest. On the contrary, she began to idealize him as a caring family man and an honest worker. In her mind, he was the perfect man, capable of giving her the love and stability she had dreamed of all her life. Oscar, for his part, initially perceived Deborah's attention as normal customer courtesy. However, her sincere interest in his work and life flattered his ego. At home, he felt increasingly alienated from Susan, who was absorbed in school matters and raising their children. Conversations with Deborah became an outlet in his routine life. Gradually, their meetings began to last longer than the time allotted for repairs. Oscar talked about his plans to expand his business, the difficulties in his relationships with parts suppliers, and his pride in his children's successes at school. Deborah listened attentively, asked questions, and shared her feelings about her work and loneliness. For Deborah, these conversations became the most important moments in her life. She planned her visits to the workshop in advance, carefully chose her clothes, and prepared topics for conversation. In her imagination, her relationship with Oscar had already gone far beyond that of a customer and mechanic, although he had not yet shown any obvious signs of romantic interest. The turning point in Deborah and Oscar's relationship came on a rainy October evening. Deborah arrived at the workshop 10 minutes before closing time, claiming there was a strange noise coming from her engine. Oscar had already sent his assistant Mike home and was working alone, finishing repairs on the last car of the day. "Listen, Mrs. Brown," he said, wiping his hands with a rag. "It's late, and I won't have time to look at your car today. Maybe you could come back tomorrow morning?" Deborah felt panic rising inside her. She had been preparing for this meeting all day, rehearsing what she would say in front of the mirror. "Please, I'm really scared to drive with that noise. What if it's something serious?" There was such genuine concern in her voice that Oscar couldn't refuse. He started the car and listened to the engine. There was no knocking. The engine was running smoothly and quietly. Oscar realized that Deborah had probably made up the problem, but her upset appearance made him feel sympathetic. "You know what?" he said gently. "Let me put the kettle on. You look worried. Maybe we could just talk?" It was the first invitation that changed the nature of their relationship. In the small break room of the workshop, over cups of instant coffee, Deborah opened up about her loneliness for the first time. Her words flowed freely about her failed marriage, her infertility, how difficult it was to start over in a new city. Oscar listened with mixed feelings. On the one hand, he felt sorry for this woman. On the other hand, her candor and vulnerability awakened in him a desire to protect and comfort her, something he hadn't felt in a long time. At home, Susan was strong and independent, rarely needing his emotional support. "You know," he finally said, "my life isn't as perfect as it might seem. Sometimes you feel like a hamster on a wheel. Work, home, bills, responsibilities, and no one asks what you want." This confession was the beginning of their emotional closeness. In the weeks that followed, their meetings in the workshop became more personal and longer. Oscar talked about how he had grown distant from his wife after the birth of their children, how he felt invisible in his own home. Deborah shared her dreams of a real family, of what kind of wife she would be to someone who could love her. Gradually, Deborah began to occupy more and more of Oscar's thoughts. He caught himself waiting for her visits and preparing topics for conversation in advance. When she didn't show up for several days in a row, he felt disappointed and anxious. Deborah, meanwhile, was undergoing a real emotional revolution. For the first time in years, she felt needed and understood. In the diary she kept on Dr. Green's recommendation, entries of a completely new nature appeared. Oscar said, "I'm good at understanding people. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. He sees things in me that others don't." Deborah's mental state began to change cyclically. On the days she saw Oscar, she was on the rise, energetic, optimistic, full of plans. On the days without meetings, she sank into depression, analyzing his every word, looking for hidden meanings and subtext. She began to study Oscar as a subject of research. She learned that he came to the studio at 7 in the morning, had lunch at Mary's Diner on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and shopped at the same supermarket where she worked. Deborah adjusted her schedule so that she would accidentally run into him as often as possible. Deborah's co-workers noticed the change in her behavior. She became more sociable, started paying attention to her appearance, and bought new clothes. Linda Rogers, a cashier who worked at the next register, asked her one day, "Deborah, is there someone new in your life? You look different." Deborah blushed and shook her head, but inside she was elated. Even strangers noticed her transformation. This confirmed that her feelings for Oscar were right. Meanwhile, relations in the Mitchell family continued to deteriorate. Oscar became even more distant and distracted. Susan caught him on the phone several times, quickly ending the conversation when she appeared. One evening, she asked him directly, "Oscar, what's going on with you? You seem like you're living in another world. The kids are asking why Daddy is always so sad." Oscar felt a pang of guilt, but couldn't find the words to explain. He hadn't been physically unfaithful to his wife, but emotionally he had been gone for a long time. "Just a lot of work, Sue. The economy is tough. People are putting off car repairs." Susan didn't believe his explanation, but decided not to press the issue for now. She hoped it was just a temporary problem related to a midlife crisis. The turning point came in early November. Deborah came to the workshop in a particularly depressed state. The day before, she had missed her appointment with Dr. Green and hadn't taken her morning medication. At the supermarket, she had an altercation with a rude customer who yelled at her because the checkout was slow. Oscar immediately noticed her state. Deborah sat in the reception area, staring into space, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down next to her. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just taking up space in this world," she whispered. "That no one needs me, that I'll die alone in my apartment and no one will even notice." Oscar felt his heart tighten with pity. Without thinking about the consequences, he put his arms around her shoulders. Deborah pressed herself against him, and at that moment something inside him finally broke. "Don't say that," he said quietly. "You are needed. You are needed by me." Those words turned Deborah's world upside down. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes. The next second, they were kissing, awkwardly, desperately, like teenagers experiencing love for the first time. After that kiss, their relationship entered a new phase. They began meeting in the workshop in the evenings when Oscar officially finished work. Deborah brought coffee and sandwiches, and they talked for hours, holding hands, sometimes kissing, but not yet daring to go further. For Deborah, these meetings became the meaning of her life. She began counting down the days until their next meeting. Detailed fantasies about their future together formed in her mind. She imagined Oscar divorcing his wife, them moving in together, perhaps to another city where no one knew their history. Oscar had mixed feelings. On the one hand, his relationship with Deborah gave him a sense of novelty and passion that he lacked in his marriage. On the other hand, his conscience tormented him. He loved his children and didn't want to destroy their family. Deborah began to insist that they not only meet at the workshop. She suggested going to a neighboring town where no one knew them, just to have dinner at a restaurant as a couple. Oscar hesitated, realizing that this would be another step toward a more serious relationship. "I can't just disappear for the whole evening," he explained. "Susan will ask questions. Tell her you're stuck at work," Deborah insisted, "or that you're going to a supplier for spare parts. We're allowed a little happiness, aren't we?" There was such passionate conviction in her voice that Oscar felt his resistance weakening. Deborah knew how to present their relationship as something noble and fateful rather than a trivial affair. Deborah's mental state was becoming increasingly unstable. Periods of euphoria from meeting Oscar were followed by deep depression when he was unavailable. She began to skip her appointments with Dr. Green, believing that love was a better cure than any pills. The conversation that changed everything took place on a cold December evening in the studio. Deborah arrived with a bouquet of flowers and a homemade pie she had baked especially for Oscar. She radiated a special excitement. Her eyes burned with a feverish glow that would have alerted any attentive observer. "Oscar, I need to tell you something," she began, barely waiting for him to close the workshop door. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about our future. I'm ready to do anything for our love." Oscar felt uneasy at her tone. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed that Deborah was becoming more insistent in her plans, talking more and more about them as a couple who were meant to be together. "Deborah, we need to talk," he said cautiously. "I feel like you're expecting more from our relationship than I can give." The smile slowly faded from Deborah's face. "What are you talking about? We love each other. Isn't that enough?" Oscar sighed heavily. This conversation had been brewing for weeks, but he had kept putting it off, not wanting to hurt Deborah. "Deborah, I have a family. Children who need me. I can't just walk away." "But you're unhappy with her!" Deborah exclaimed, the first notes of despair sounding in her voice. "You said yourself that you feel lonely in your own home. With me, you're different. Alive. Real." "That's true," Oscar admitted. "With you, I feel things I haven't felt in years. But that doesn't mean I'm ready to ruin my children's lives. Jason is about to go to college, and Emily needs stability." Deborah grabbed his hands, her fingers trembling. "What about me? What about my life? For the first time in all these years, I feel truly alive. You can't take that away from me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but behind them, Oscar saw something frightening. The desperate determination of someone who was willing to do anything to keep what they considered theirs. "I don't want to take it away," he said softly. "But we have to be realistic. Maybe we should take a break. Think about everything." "No!" Deborah shouted so sharply that Oscar involuntarily stepped back. "Don't you dare talk about a break. You're just afraid. Afraid to admit that we're meant for each other." She hugged him, pressing herself against him, and Oscar could feel her trembling with tension. "Deborah, please calm down. Let's talk about this tomorrow when you're... When I what? Come to my senses?" She interrupted him. "I've never been more in my senses than I am right now. I know what I want. I know what we need to be happy." There was something in her words that made Oscar even more wary. But before he could say anything, Deborah pulled away abruptly, wiped her tears, and tried to smile. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pressure you. Just give me time to show you that we can be happy together. Don't make any final decisions, okay?" Oscar nodded, though inside he felt a knot of dread. After Deborah left, he sat in his workshop for a long time, realizing he had gone too far, and now didn't know how to get out of this without hurting anyone. Deborah, meanwhile, spent the entire drive home trying to make sense of what had happened. In her mind, Oscar's words transformed and took on new meanings. He hadn't rejected her. He was just afraid. Afraid of change. Afraid of public opinion. Afraid of hurting the children. But these were obstacles that could be overcome. The main obstacle was his wife, Susan Mitchell, who keeps him in the marriage not out of love but out of habit and responsibility. If it weren't for her, Oscar would be free to choose his own happiness. Deborah didn't sleep that night. She paced around the apartment, made plans, and wrote her thoughts in her diary. By morning, she had a clear picture of the situation. Susan was the only obstacle standing in the way of her happiness with Oscar. In the days that followed, Deborah's behavior changed dramatically. She stopped imposing herself on Oscar and didn't come to the studio every day like she used to. Instead, she began to study the object of her hatred, Susan Mitchell. Deborah found out Susan's school schedule, figured out when she picked up her children from practice and where she shopped for groceries. Several times she followed Susan at a safe distance, studying her habits and daily routine. At the supermarket, Deborah deliberately chose shifts when Susan was there. At the checkout, she watched this woman, who, unaware of anything, was buying groceries for her family, including her cheating husband. Susan looked tired and preoccupied, clearly not a happy wife. "She doesn't even appreciate what she has," Deborah wrote in her diary. "You can see there's no spark between them. She takes Oscar for granted, like a piece of furniture. He deserves better. He deserves someone who will love him with all her heart." Deborah's mental state rapidly deteriorated. She stopped taking her medication altogether, believing it was hindering her clear thinking. She told Dr. Green that she felt great and no longer needed therapy. Entries in her diary revealed her growing paranoia. Susan suspects something. She was looking at me strangely in the store today. Maybe Oscar told her something, or did she figure it out herself? I need to be more careful. In fact, Susan did begin to suspect something, but for entirely different reasons. Her husband's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. He would stare at one spot for hours, not hear questions, forget about family plans. Several times she found receipts for coffee in his pocket from a cafe she knew he didn't go to. One evening, while the children were doing their homework, Susan decided to have a frank conversation. "Oscar, I can't take this anymore. What's going on with you? Is there someone else?" Oscar turned pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend. You've become a completely different person, distracted, distant. You avoid intimacy, you hardly talk to the children. If you have problems, we can work them out. But if you're seeing someone else..." Oscar felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. He wanted to deny everything, but the words stuck in his throat. Susan looked at him intently, and in her eyes he saw not anger but pain and exhaustion. "It's hard to explain," he finally began. "So there is someone," Susan stated. She sank into a chair as if her legs had given way. "Who is she?" "Sue, please, it's not what you think." "What is it then? Friendship? Platonic love?" There was bitterness in Susan's voice. "Oscar, we've known each other for 20 years. Don't lie to me." Oscar lowered his head. "Her name is Deborah. She's a client. It started by accident. I didn't plan it." "Are you sleeping with her?" Susan interrupted. "No, I mean we kissed, but nothing else happened." Susan laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. "Sure, just kissing. And that's supposed to comfort me?" "Sue, I'm confused. I don't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt you, but you did. You've been hurting me every day for months." Susan stood up and looked at her husband with cold dignity. "I'm not going to make a scene, but you have to make a choice. Either you end things with Deborah and we try to rebuild our marriage, or you pack your things and leave. I'm not going to live in limbo." After that conversation, the atmosphere in the Mitchell home became unbearably tense. The children sensed that something had happened between their parents, but they didn't dare ask. Oscar was tormented by the choice, knowing that either decision would hurt someone. Deborah, unaware of the Mitchell's family crisis, continued her observations of Susan. She discovered that Susan stayed late at school on Thursdays, preparing materials for her lessons. The children went home alone on those days, and Oscar usually worked in his workshop until 7 in the evening. "The perfect time," she wrote in her diary. "The house is empty, the neighbors are at work, no one will see, no one will hear." Deborah spent the next few days feverishly planning. She studied the Mitchell's house plan, which had been posted online when they put it up for sale 3 years ago, but then decided against it. She found out that the back door led to the garden, which was hidden from view by a high fence. At a hardware store, she bought rope, gloves, and a small crowbar, supposedly for repairs in her apartment. The cashier, who knew her by sight, even joked, "Deborah, I didn't know you were handy." "I'm learning," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Deborah's mental state had reached a critical point. Reality and fantasy had become so mixed in her mind that she was completely convinced that what she was doing was right. In her fevered brain, killing Susan was not a crime, but an act of love, freeing Oscar from an unhappy marriage. "He'll understand," she wrote in her diary. "Maybe not right away, but he'll understand. I'm doing this for us, for our future, for the love we deserve." On Wednesday evening, Deborah called Oscar's workshop. "Hi, it's me," she said in a voice that sounded strangely calm. "Can we meet tomorrow evening?" "Deborah, I have something to tell you," Oscar began. "Susan knows. About us. She demanded that I make a choice." Deborah felt everything inside her freeze. "And what did you decide?" A long pause. I think we really need to stop. This has gone too far." "I understand," Deborah said quietly. "So you chose her." "Deborah, it's not that simple." "It's simple, Oscar. You made your choice. I'll make mine." She hung up without waiting for a response. There were no tears in her eyes, only cold determination. Tomorrow, Thursday, when Susan was home alone, Deborah would visit her. They would talk woman to woman, and one of them would not survive that conversation. Deborah took a black jacket and jeans out of the closet and checked that her tools were in her bag. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would finally get what she deserved. Oscar's love and gratitude for freeing him from the woman who made him miserable. In her last diary entry, written late at night, she wrote, "Sometimes love requires sacrifice. Tomorrow I will prove to Oscar that I am willing to do anything for our happiness. He will understand. He has to understand." Thursday, December 14th, began like any other winter day in Chandler. The snow that had been falling all night covered the city in a white blanket, making the familiar streets quiet and peaceful. Susan Mitchell woke up at 6 in the morning as usual and began her usual morning ritual, making breakfast for the family, waking the children, and checking their homework. The atmosphere in the house had been tense ever since she found out about Oscar's affair. They barely spoke, communicating only when necessary and in front of the children. Jason and Emily sensed the coldness between their parents, but didn't dare ask what was going on. "Mom, are you going to be late again today?" Emily asked, tying her shoelaces. "Yes, dear. I have a parent-teacher conference. Then I need to prepare materials for tomorrow's lessons. Will you and Jason have dinner without me?" Oscar looked up from his coffee cup. "What time do you plan to be back?" "Not before 8, Susan replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. After the children left for school, the couple remained alone in the kitchen. The silence was heavy and awkward. "Sue, we need to talk," Oscar began. "About what? About how you ended your affair with your mistress, or whether we should try to save our marriage?" Susan's voice sounded more tired than angry. "I'm done. Yesterday. I told her it was over." Susan nodded. "And how did she take it?" Oscar remembered his last conversation with Deborah, her strangely calm voice and her cryptic words about making her choice. "I don't know. She seemed strange to me." "Strange how?" "Too calm. She usually reacts very emotionally to everything, but this time it was as if she had been expecting it." Susan shrugged. "Maybe she also realized that this couldn't go on forever. Oscar, I don't know if we can rebuild what we had, but for the sake of the children, we have to try." Oscar nodded, feeling both relief and guilt. He didn't tell his wife about the strange feeling of unease that had been with him since his conversation with Deborah yesterday. At 8 in the morning, Oscar left for his workshop, and Susan drove to school. The day passed in the usual rhythm of lessons and schoolwork. After class, she stayed for a teachers' meeting, which lasted until 5:30. Deborah Brown woke up that Thursday with crystal clarity of purpose. She hadn't slept much of the night, but she felt surprisingly alert and focused. There was no room for doubt in her mind, only a clear plan of action. In the morning, she called in sick to work. Frank, the manager, didn't ask any questions. Deborah rarely took sick days, and her voice did sound strange. She spent the whole day preparing. She checked the contents of her bag: rope, a crowbar, gloves, a knife from the kitchen set. She changed into dark clothes that wouldn't attract attention. She went over the plan in her head several times from start to finish. At 5 in the evening, she got into her car and drove to the Mitchell's house. She parked 2 blocks away on a quiet street where her car wouldn't attract attention. She walked to the house and made sure Oscar wasn't there. His pickup truck wasn't in the driveway. The house was dark, with only one light on in a second-story window, which she knew was the master bedroom. Deborah walked around to the back of the house, where a tall fence hid her from the neighbor's view. The back door was locked, but the old lock gave way after a few minutes of careful work with a crowbar. She entered the house through the kitchen. It was quiet inside, except for the ticking of the clock in the living room and music playing somewhere upstairs. Deborah knew the layout of the house and climbed the stairs silently. Susan was in her home office, which also served as a library. She was sitting at her desk, bent over some notebooks, checking her students' work. She was wearing a housecoat, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired and absorbed in her work. Deborah watched her from the doorway for a few minutes. In her troubled mind, This ordinary female figure represented all the obstacles standing in the way of her happiness. She's not even pretty, Deborah thought. What does he see in her? Susan sensed someone else's presence and looked up. Seeing the unfamiliar woman in the doorway, she was startled but tried to remain calm. "Excuse me? Who are you? How did you get into the house?" Deborah entered the room, closing the door behind her. "My name is Deborah Brown. I think your husband told you about me." Susan's face paled. "Are you that woman?" "That's me," Deborah confirmed, sitting down in a chair across from the table. "We need to talk. I have nothing to discuss with you. Please leave my house." Susan tried to stand up, but Deborah stopped her with a gesture. "Sit down. We'll talk like civilized people." Deborah's voice sounded like a strange mixture of politeness and threat. Susan slowly sank back into the chair, keeping her eyes on her uninvited guest. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about our mutual interest. About Oscar." Deborah spoke calmly, but her hands nervously fiddled with the handle of her bag. "You see, we have a special connection. He told me how unhappy he was in this marriage." "That's a lie," Susan replied sharply. "We have problems like any family, but—" "Don't lie to yourself," Deborah interrupted. "He told me he felt trapped, that he married too young without having lived a real life, that you've become roommates instead of loving spouses." Each word hit Susan like a blow, partly because there was some truth in them. Their marriage was indeed in crisis, the passion long gone, replaced by habit and responsibility. "Even if that's true," Susan said, trying to control her voice, "it's none of your business. This is our family, our problems." "But now it's my business," Deborah replied, and an unhealthy gleam appeared in her eyes. "Because I love him, truly, not like you do, out of habit, out of a sense of duty, but with real, all-consuming love." Susan felt a growing sense of unease. This woman was clearly not herself. "Listen, I understand that you're upset, but Oscar has made his choice. He's staying with his family." "Only because you made him," Deborah cried, losing her composure for the first time. "You're blackmailing him with his children, threatening him with divorce. But I won't let you destroy his happiness." "His happiness? What about the happiness of our children, Jason and Emily?" Susan tried to appeal to common sense. "The children will adapt. Children always adapt. But a broken heart cannot be mended." Deborah stood up and began to pace the room. "Do you know what it's like to love someone with all your heart and realize that they are unhappy with someone else?" "He's my husband!" Susan shouted, also standing up. "The father of my children! We've been together for 20 years! 20 years of misery! 20 years of living in a cage!" Deborah stopped in front of the table, staring at Susan with burning eyes. "But I can set him free! I can give him what you can never give him! True love!" "You're sick," Susan said quietly. "You need help. Let me call a doctor." "Don't you dare say I'm sick!" Deborah exploded. "I'm the only sane one here! I see the truth that you refuse to acknowledge!" Susan tried to reach the phone, but Deborah blocked her way. "Don't call anyone! We're not done talking yet!" "What is there to talk about?" Susan tried to remain calm, even though her heart was pounding. "You want my husband. I get that. But he chose his family. Accept it. He made the wrong choice. Because of you. Because of your selfishness." Deborah opened her bag and took out a rope. "But I can fix it." Susan froze when she saw the rope. "What are you going to do?" "What's necessary for our happiness," Deborah replied simply, as if she were talking about the most ordinary thing in the world. Susan rushed to the door, but Deborah was quicker. A struggle ensued. Susan was physically stronger, but Deborah was driven by a mad determination. "Help! Help me!" Susan screamed, hoping the neighbors would hear. "No one will come," Deborah hissed, trying to throw the rope around her victim's neck. "They're all at work, and your kids won't be home until 8. The struggle continued for several minutes. Susan fought desperately, scratching her attacker and trying to break free. But Deborah was relentless. At one point, Susan tripped over the edge of the carpet and fell, hitting her head on the corner of the table. Seizing the moment, Deborah threw the rope around the half-conscious woman's neck and began to tighten it. Susan gasped, trying to loosen the noose with her fingers, but her strength was leaving her. "Forgive me," Deborah whispered, tightening the rope. I didn't want to hurt you, but there's no other way. Oscar must be free. Susan stopped struggling. Her arms fell limply, her eyes rolled back. Deborah held the rope for a few more minutes to make sure it was over. Then she carefully unclenched her fingers and stepped back. Susan Mitchell lay on the office floor in an unnatural position, the rope still around her neck. Her eyes were open and staring at the ceiling with a blank expression. Deborah sank into a chair, breathing heavily. She felt a strange emptiness instead of the expected relief. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs. "Now he's free," she said aloud, as if trying to convince herself. "Now we can be together." She sat there for a few more minutes, staring at the body. Then she got up, put the rope and her other things in her bag, and carefully wiped her fingerprints off the surfaces she had touched. As she left the house, she turned and looked at the study window. The light was no longer on. Oscar Mitchell closed his workshop at 6:30 and drove home. On the way, he thought about his conversation with his wife that morning, about how they would rebuild their relationship. Maybe he should suggest family therapy, or just take a trip somewhere together like in the old days. When he pulled up to the house, he noticed that the lights were on downstairs but dark upstairs. Strange. Susan usually worked in her study late into the evening. "Sue, I'm home!" he called as he walked through the front door. No one answered. There was no one in the living room or the kitchen. Oscar went upstairs. "Sue, where are you?" The study door was closed. Oscar pushed it open and went inside. What he saw made his world collapse in an instant. Susan was lying on the floor face up, with marks around her neck from a rope. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. The school notebooks she had been checking were still on the table. "Oh my God, Sue, no!" Oscar fell to his knees next to his wife's body and touched her hand. It was cold. He tried to find her pulse, even though he knew it was too late. He tried to give her CPR, but her body was lifeless. "No, no, no!" He hugged his dead wife and held her close. "Sue, I'm sorry, I'm sorry!" For several minutes, he just held her, crying and repeating her name. Then he realized he had to call the police. With trembling hands, he dialed 911. "Emergency services. How can I help you? My wife is dead. Someone killed my wife." Oscar's voice trembled with shock and grief. "Sir, please give me your address." 1247 Elm Street, Chandler. Please hurry. "A car is on its way. Sir, do not touch anything at the scene. Step away from the body and wait for the police to arrive." Oscar hung up and looked at his wife again. Only one thought ran through his mind. This is my fault. If it weren't for my affair with Deborah, this would never have happened. 10 minutes later, police cars and an ambulance pulled up to the house. Detective Michael Connor was among the first to arrive at the scene. Connor had been with the Chandler Police Department for 15 years and had seen it all. But murders were extremely rare in their quiet town. The last one had been 4 years ago, a drunken brawl that ended in death. "Mr. Mitchell?" he asked Oscar, who was sitting in the living room under the watchful eye of a patrol officer. "I'm Detective Connor. I'm very sorry for your loss." Oscar looked up with red eyes. "Who could have done this? Why? Sue never hurt anyone." "We'll find out," Connor promised. "Tell me what happened. When did you get home?" "At 6:30. The house was dark, which I thought was strange. I went upstairs, went into the study, and found her." "Did you touch anything in the study?" "I tried to give her CPR. I know it was too late, but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Connor nodded understandingly. "When was the last time you saw your wife before that?" "In the morning, before work. She said she was going to stay late at school for a teacher's meeting and to prepare for her lessons." "Did your wife have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" Oscar shook his head. "No, everyone loved her. The children, her colleagues, the parents of her students. She was a good person." Connor noticed how the man's voice broke on the last words. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some personal questions. Did you and your wife have any problems in your marriage?" Oscar froze. He knew this question would come up sooner or later, but he still wasn't ready for it. "We've been having some difficulties lately," he finally admitted. "What kind of difficulties?" Oscar covered his face with his hands. I was cheating on her. She found out recently, but I ended the affair. I told her last night that it was over. Detective Connor listened intently, taking notes. What was the woman's name? Deborah Brown. She was a client of mine. How did she react when you told her you were ending the relationship? Strangely, too calm. She's usually very emotional, but she just said something about making her own choice. Connor looked up from his notebook. Repeat her exact words. She said, "So you've made your choice. I'll make mine." The detective felt a red light go off in his head. The statistics were relentless. In most cases, the perpetrators of murders of women were either husbands or lovers. Mr. Mitchell, where can you find this Deborah Brown? Detective Michael Connor wasted no time. Within an hour of talking to Oscar Mitchell, he had Deborah Brown's address and was on his way there, accompanied by 2 patrol officers. On the way, he contacted the district attorney's office to obtain a search warrant. The Pine Valley Apartments residential complex greeted them with silence. It was almost 9 o'clock in the evening, and most of the residents were at home. Connor went up to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door of apartment 2B. Deborah opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting a visitor. She was dressed in a bathrobe, her hair damp from a shower. There was no surprise or fear on her face, only a strange calmness. "Deborah Brown?" the detective asked, showing his badge. "Yes, that's me," she replied in an even voice. "I'm Detective Connor with the Chandler Police Department. I need to ask you a few questions about Oscar Mitchell." "Of course. Come in." Deborah stepped aside, letting the police officers into the apartment. Connor looked around. The apartment was clean and tidy, with potted flowers everywhere. An open book and a cup of tea were on the coffee table. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. "Mrs. Brown, when was the last time you saw Oscar Mitchell?" "Last night. He called me at the workshop." Deborah sat down in an armchair, folding her hands in her lap. "He said his wife found out about our relationship." "And how did you react to that news?" "I was upset, of course, but I knew it had to happen sooner or later." Her voice sounded surprisingly calm for a woman who had supposedly just lost the man she loved. "Mr. Mitchell said he was ending the relationship with you. Is that true?" "Yes. He said he was choosing his family." Something like pain flashed in Deborah's eyes, but she quickly regained her composure. "Where were you this evening between 5 and 7? "At home. I was sick, so I didn't go to work. I spent the whole day here." Deborah pointed to the book and the cup. "Reading, drinking tea, trying to take my mind off things. Can anyone confirm that? Did your neighbors see you?" "I don't think so. I haven't left the house all day." Connor took notes, observing her behavior. The woman was too calm for someone who had just been asked about her alibi in a murder case. "Mrs. Brown, I have to tell you that Susan Mitchell is dead. She was killed tonight." Deborah froze, as if she didn't understand what he was saying. Then she slowly shook her head. "That's impossible. She was a young, healthy woman. She was strangled with a rope in her own home." Deborah's face showed shock, but Connor thought it was insincere, too theatrical, too late. "Oh my God, poor Oscar. What about the children?" She covered her mouth with her hand. "Who could have done this?" "We hope you can help us find out. Do you mind if we look around the apartment?" "Do you have a warrant?" Deborah asked, her voice betraying her caution for the first time. "We're getting one, but if you have nothing to hide, fine. Go ahead." Deborah stood up and moved toward the window. The search took half an hour. In the closet, the police found a black jacket and jeans, clean but with faint stains that could have been blood. In the trash can, they found used gloves, and in her purse, they found a rope of the same type used in the murder. "Mrs. Brown, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Susan Mitchell," Connor said, taking out a pair of handcuffs. Deborah's face remained impassive. "You're making a mistake, Detective. I didn't kill anyone." "You have the right to remain silent." While Connor read her rights, Deborah stared out the window at the city lights. There was no fear or despair in her eyes, only a kind of detachment, as if none of this was happening to her. At the police station, Deborah refused a lawyer and agreed to give a statement. She sat in the interrogation room, sipping coffee from a plastic cup, and answered the questions calmly. Tell me about your relationship with Oscar Mitchell, Connor asked. We fell in love. It was real, not just a fling. Deborah's voice took on a warm tone. He was unhappy in his marriage. His wife didn't understand him, took him for granted. And that's why you decided to kill her? I didn't kill anyone, Deborah repeated. But if I had, wouldn't it have been an act of mercy? To free him from an unhappy marriage? Connor felt a chill run down his spine. This woman was talking about murder as if it were a noble deed. The rope in your purse, the gloves in the trash can, how do you explain that? The rope? I bought it for sports, and I used the gloves for cleaning. Deborah shrugged. That's not evidence. The interrogation continued throughout the night. Deborah did not confess, but her alibi crumbled under the weight of the facts. Surveillance cameras had recorded her car near the Mitchell's house. Her fingerprints were found on the rope. Forensic tests showed that the stains on her clothes were indeed the victim's blood. In the morning, Dr. Elizabeth Green arrived at the station. Upon learning of her patient's arrest, she immediately came to talk to the police. Deborah suffers from borderline personality disorder with elements of bipolar disorder, she explained to Connor. She has missed appointments and not taken her medication in recent months. I was afraid that this could lead to a crisis. Could she have committed murder in that state? Unfortunately, yes. When the disorder flares up, patients can lose touch with reality and not control their actions, especially if there's a strong emotional trigger. Dr. Green gave the police Deborah's medical records, including the diary she had kept on her recommendation. The latest entries were particularly telling. Oscar is my destiny. I am willing to do anything for our love. His wife is an obstacle that must be removed. Tomorrow everything will change. Tomorrow I will set him free. By the evening of the next day, the prosecutor's office had enough evidence to charge Deborah with first-degree murder. Deborah continued to deny her guilt, but a psychiatric evaluation showed that she was aware of her actions and able to control them. The news of the murder shocked Chandler. In such a small town, everyone knew each other, and Susan Mitchell's death was a tragedy for the entire community. Her students cried when they heard what had happened. Colleagues organized a fundraiser for the family. Oscar fell into a deep depression. He blamed himself for his wife's death, realizing that his affair with Deborah had caused the tragedy. Jason and Emily were left without a mother, and their father was so consumed with grief that he was unable to help them. "It's my fault," he repeated to Susan's brother, who had come to help with the children. If it weren't for that affair, she would still be alive. The trial began 4 months later. Deborah remained calm, answering questions politely but without emotion. The defense tried to prove she was insane, but the expert testimony was damning. The woman understood the nature of her actions. Oscar testified for the prosecution. It was difficult for him to look at Deborah, remembering their intimacy and what she had become. "I never asked her to harm my wife," he said, looking away from the defendant. "I just wanted to end our relationship in a civilized manner." "But you loved me!" Deborah shouted, losing her composure for the first time during the entire trial. "You said you were unhappy with her. I just wanted to set you free." The judge called her to order, but the words had already been spoken. Silence fell in the courtroom. Everyone understood that they were looking at a truly sick woman who had killed out of a twisted understanding of love. The jury returned a guilty verdict after 3 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Deborah Brown to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After hearing the sentence, Deborah stood motionless. Then she turned to Oscar and said quietly, "I still love you. I always will." Those were her last words as a free woman. Oscar closed his workshop and moved with his children to another state, to Susan's parents' home. He could no longer live in the house where his wife had been killed, or work in the workshop where their fateful relationship had begun. Dr. Green continued to treat Deborah in prison. The woman gradually began to accept reality, but she never fully repented for what she had done. "I did what I had to do," she said during therapy sessions. "Maybe the methods were wrong, but the goal was noble." The house on Elm Street stood empty for a long time. No one wanted to buy a house where a murder had taken place. Eventually, It was torn down and replaced with a small memorial park in honor of Susan Mitchell. Chandler gradually recovered from his trauma, but the residents remembered the story for a long time as a reminder of how quickly love can turn into obsession and passion into tragedy.